Well, I'm an immigrant, but we
We have
have
a
two
great
great
host.
hosts, me and Seth. But we have a special guest, which is also great, named John. Oh, John, help me pronounce the last name so I don't mess it up.
It's Munitz.
Munitz.
Yes.
See, you know, it was actually easy. So, John, we want to thank him. He's coming in to bring some expertise. We promise you guys, we're always going to bring in experts who know more than us. We don't know everything. We know this much in the world. So we have to bring in experts who really have real good expertise and different items in different fields. So we look forward to having a great show, having this insight, his political beliefs, his perspectives, and what he believes that we can really do to change with a progressive message. So I look forward to hearing what he has to say. With that being said, I'll pass it to Seth.
Yeah, I think John is a special guest for us. I feel like I'd consider him like the godfather of the show. Like
Yeah.
I drew a lot of inspiration from him doing his own thing with the People's Basics. That was your show for a while. I don't know if you're still doing anything with that, or if that kind of fizzled out or something. But either way, we had a good conversation with John right before we started this show, and it kind of turned into what we have now today.
Yeah. So
You
go
still
ahead, John. Let's hear it.
Okay, yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I, as Seth mentioned, used to do the People's Basics. I now no longer do the People's Basics because you know what? I wanted to just focus on more important things in my life right now that have happened in the past year. You know, starting a family, getting finances in order, and I'll just admit it, podcasting doesn't pay bills. And so I was putting a lot of time into that, and I had to focus on paying the bills.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we disbanded the network. I'm focusing right now. I work at a company called American Tower. I am the innovation program manager there. So I get to do a lot of the early stage research into sustainability projects like energy projects or improving our telecommunications. And I continue on the side to do a lot of writing in the political space. I'm working on a book currently, as well as I advocate frequently on Twitter about the subject of universal policies and why they're so much better than these targeted solutions of means testing, work testing, etc.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm glad that, he's coming on and giving his expertise in that holistic change because the reality is climate change is a big deal right now. And this past weekend, on this Friday, Saturday, Sunday, two back-to-back crazy news out in the northern part of Africa. The first was Morocco, which had, I want to say here, roughly about Moroccan, it's about 2,000. Yeah, it was about 2,000 deaths because they had a 6.8 magnitude earthquake that struck them. And I don't know if you guys, you guys seen what's happening in Hawaii, in Maui, and
Mhm.
some of the fire devastation that's happening there, and earthquakes and hurricanes. Climate change is real, and it's becoming so evident. The next day on Sunday, there was 5,000 presumed dead in Libya because of flooding, breaking dams and sweeping homes away, and then they project that to go up to 10,000. So there are many people are losing their lives. Right, just in the top of my head, my simple math, roughly around 20,000 people already that they have died because of climate change, and that's literally over a weekend. We have we our solution has been targeting solutions. We've been trying to let's get more this amount of electric vehicles on the road. Let's reduce our carbon footprint by this amount. Let's use recycling by this amount. It doesn't seem like they're moving fast enough. And for me, target approaches is kind of the reason for that. So I don't know if you guys want to chime in what some of you guys think some holistic changes that we could do to speed up that process of trying to get ourselves um, have less impact on the environment.
Yeah, I don't know the exact details of like the Green New Deal, but there's a lot of people on the left that would advocate for like a systematic change to how we rely on fossil fuels, stuff like that. And it's difficult because I don't really know exactly what is listed within the Green New Deal. There's so many different proposals and just different versions of Green New Deal, but I think a lot of people just agree with the concept that like we're not gonna fix this problem by slowly transitioning over like the next 30 years into like, by then maybe we'll just have electric cars, and maybe we'll have more solar power. Like, it's gonna take a lot more dramatic investment in green energy today, because what we're seeing in these countries with worse infrastructure than us is they don't have the infrastructure to deal with these kind of environmental catastrophes, and then they're spending dramatically more on fixing these problems, and they're losing lives than it would be to just preemptively, fix the solution ahead of time. And I mean, it's not like one country could avoid climate catastrophe by investing in green energy. So that's kind of the issue. But it's, I don't know, maybe it's more like game theory. If we don't all do it together, I don't know, we're not going to get it done. But we all have to start chipping in, like cutting down this ozone layer by, reducing the amount of pollution that we're putting into the environment, because there are actual lives at stake here.
Yeah.
And not to mention the billions of dollars that are just going to be wasted by the greed of all these people who are at the very top of like ExxonMobil and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's ultimately what's pushing it. And like the media is controlled by these companies is the reason why the United States has like the highest climate change denialism out of like any country on earth. It's like at least like top 3 if it's not number 1. Like, it's directly fueled by the media and misinformation, intentional misinformation. So there's definitely something we got to do about that.
Yeah. So, John, this is where you come in with your holistic approach, and let's see.
Yeah, sure. So a couple things there. First, on the opening points that Jesse mentioned in terms of the specific cases, he was saying in Africa, I am feeling terrible for the people who are in the most sensitive areas of our world being impacted by climate change. Those that are near our equator are the most vulnerable groups, because the big impact of global climate change is, we wanted to go away from this word because there are a multitude of effects, but one of the biggest was global warming. And so when you think about the areas that are most impacted by that, it is going to be in that region. It's why we talk about things like storms so frequently, because it is the heat that is causing more evaporation of our water, that is creating more volatile storms. Now, I don't want to completely badmouth the idea of incremental change. I think that's actually an incredibly valuable process, because when you think about climate change, holistically, there are so many systems that actually consume energy that we have to be touching on a variety of systems. And that comes from how we are over consuming of products and handling recycling, as you were mentioning. It comes from agriculture and making sure that we are changing the way we raise certain animal livestock as well as our produce, so that we are not, needing as much fertilizer and needing as much, wasteful methods. It's coming from transforming our infrastructure and energy systems. That way we aren't consuming as much when we need to go from point A to point B. It may not be like sexy to give a complicated answer to the problem, but it's because you actually do need to take a multi-pronged approach. It's not a simple problem that we can adjust. And so having solutions that at times are incentive structures to make wide amounts of people in their own individual private decisions make better decisions is important too. And so we have recent legislation that was a big deal. We haven't had this in a long while of infrastructure investment and clean energy investment. It didn't go as far as I would like. There's more that does need to be done on top of it, and I'm happy to go into that. But there was a lot of, incentives for a lot of companies to look into more clean energy projects. That's a field that I'm currently working in. I work with a variety of developers who are now in the energy space, working in the battery field, because there is so much incentive to produce clean energy right now that generators are producing more than they can handle. And so it's causing, in some places, them having to give it to others so that their battery systems aren't, blowing capacity. It is requiring these groups to think smarter. And when you look at the past year's trend, solar energy prices have gone down precipitously, over 30% cuts. So a lot of these investments are really helping move the needle and drive adoption. I think we need to go further. I think we need a comprehensive approach beyond just solar. And we also got to make sure that the infrastructure is in place so that when we invest in these clean energy approaches, we can actually make them go from point A to B, because it's all a trade-off. A lot of people who do advocate for fossil fuel, even genuinely, not the people who are doing it just for money needs, is because there was a need for having fuel storage in independent locations that they can access much more easily. When you don't have the transmission system, the battery systems already developed in place, it's really hard for clean energy systems to be actually reliable and sustainable. Because you need to have those off times when it's not windy or not sunny to be able to store it and release it back out into the system. And so I think we need to do a lot more, but I don't want to discredit whatsoever trying to go at this with 1,000 different cuts, because it does really take a comprehensive approach.
No, I agree. I mean, I just feel like the different approaches and the different solutions that we, for example, the best way to use this is in World War II when we had it was a common sense of the world understanding that the three axes of power. This is World War II, by the way. Um, Together, we understood as a world that they cannot win because for them winning would change the fabric of what the world is looking for, which is usually an individual country looking for democracy and the freedom of choice. And just a simple fact, you shouldn't persecute a group of people. There's 11 million Jews that died because of this. So us as a world citizens, where it's like, no, we are going to stand up for fascism. We're going to stand up against it. So now we have this new war, this climate war that we're having, which is a world's problem. I don't feel like we have the same the zealous beliefs and zealous attitude towards conquering that problem as a holistic approach. And the worlds are coming together to find common solutions. I feel as if right now we have this policy where it's just you have the USA impact and you have the world impact. And the world impact is not the same as USA. Like we can have all these policy changes, but reality we're in one sector of the world and there's only 300 million of us. When you have people like China and India has approximately around 4 billion people in that whole region who has very lax climate change laws. I feel like we put a lot of these governments the feet to the fire, like China and India, when it comes to economic policies. When we don't agree with them economically, we do things, sanctions or different things that we do within our policies to make China and India, or these great polluted countries, reverse their policies. But I feel like we're not doing that when it comes to climate change. When it comes to climate change, we're just kind of letting them do whatever they want, and we're like, we're gonna do what we can as America, but we're not gonna hold their feet to the fire to create policy initiatives so that they can reverse some of the damage they're also doing to the air and to our their population as a world. So I don't know what you guys think about that. Do you think like we should use economic sanctions to kind of force the other countries into creating more climate incentives in their countries?
I don't know how well the U.S. could do that, especially since we aren't doing like that much more. It's not like we are like leading the world in green energy so we can hold everyone else to some certain standard. It's like we're just as liable and we have just as many problems as they do. They may have way more emissions, they have way more people. So it makes a lot of sense. But it's also like the people, it's not very realistic that our governments would sacrifice their economic like productivity to go directly after these major giant companies, especially since the people controlling the governments of each of these companies have different class issues, and they're not the ones that are going to be affected by climate change catastrophes. The problem is it's going to be everyone else who doesn't have any sort of control over the situation in the first place, and we're all going to suffer, and we can't really control our government in the first place. So it is way more multifaceted, and it's a lot of different countries involved that need to fix this issue. But we can't even like fix our own government, so it's kind of difficult. We're not very accountable to even the desires of our people. So until we fix our own government's initiative towards climate action, like even Biden, who's you know, very pro climate change or pro climate change initiative rather, uh, even he did like the Willow Project and stuff like that, just because of electoral benefits it would give to him, because it would reduce gas prices and stuff like that. Like he's willing to do certain drilling there and there if it benefits his personal material interests or his electoral interests. You know what I mean? So this is kind of like a problem around the world. They like I'm sure a lot of these politicians in India, China are aware of what they're doing, but it's like, are you going to be the one to cause sort of economic downturn because they're getting completely off of oil, and you want your people to have their gas prices go up? Like it's something that we all together, like every single person needs to realize how they contribute to climate change, even if everybody's individual actions don't do anything. It's like we're the ones relying on gas to drive every day. So we're the ones that are, you know, trying to get our government to reduce the gas prices. We're complaining about gas all the time instead of switching to electric or hybrid. Like it's just tiny decisions we make throughout the day that are sort of affirming the action of the governments that are protecting fossil fuel industries, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know how well we could really do economic sanctions. I think it's more of like a trade policy kind of deal that we would have to do to alter their behavior. I don't think sanctions would be a great idea. I know stuff like there's a lot of mixed opinions about like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but I know that had like way more economic, or sorry, there are way more environmental standards that they're holding towards all these Southeastern Asian countries, that if we, you know, agreed to reduce tariffs and stuff like that and increase their trade with these smaller countries to boost their economy, it's like, well, then you got to be held to these economic, environmental standards and workplace democracy or workplace standards, like these kind of things that would go along with sort of trade policies. So I think it's more of a trade issue than like we could use, because sanctions decimate a lot of countries. I'm not gonna lie, a lot of countries are really suffering because of sanctions.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's not like something we want to make people suffer because of the actions of the government.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, you know, I kind of agree with Seth in that this is largely, in my opinion, on the international stage, going to require trade policy to be at front and center. I think
Yeah.
we're not going to get as much success engaging in a direct trade war with China on this issue. I think the better way to work around these partners is to gather a coalition who is on board with these by presenting the carrot, by actually making the investments into these regions. One of the big drivers of so much of this, you know, cause of, you know, dirty fuel use in China and India is many countries, when they are going through the economic development curve, especially older civilizations going through that industrialization, are highly relying to generate large amounts of energy at scale from these means, because a lot of these technologies were in their infancy. But right now, a lot of these countries as well are making their investments into solar, into hydropower. There are multi-billion-dollar projects that are going through India in solar currently, as well as hydro right now in China. Not to mention, they've been doing in the past tons of solar development. Now, this is something that there is more work to be done. As you have mentioned, they are still huge emitters, like we are.
Mhm.
And so I think you are absolutely right. There's more to be done in reforming our government so it is more responsive, and so it takes more dramatic steps when it's passing these like legislations they actually accomplish, if at all.
Yeah.
And so, but I don't think we should take the approach that nothing really can be done until government is reformed. We do need
I
to
agree with
have
that.
private decisions that are saying we're going to drive forward this technology, not just because it's sustainable, because it's cost effective and it's actually convenient for people too. Having these technologies get the investment of subsidies at times. This is one of the few areas where I'm actually okay with subsidies. Developing these new
I
energy
agree.
technologies is one of those few areas because it allows us to have so much downstream beneficial industrial effect from having that, as well as even residential, cost of living effects. Energy is one of the big drivers of costs across industries. And so to make sure that that's affordable makes a lot of sense. Now, you got to make sure that it's tied to certain standards so that it's actually being appropriately used, so it's being put where you need it. But that's something we need to be considering. And I genuinely think that when it comes to this area, we do need, certain key things government needs to be involved in. You mentioned public transit beforehand. That's something that we're not going to just have private industry dominating
Yeah.
anymore. We need that to be a public decision of where it's going to be placed. We cannot be building it willy-nilly, devastating certain underprivileged communities because it's a private decision. We need public input on that decision, but we need
Mhm.
that investment that is going across sometimes state lines where it's going to have the federal government's intervention anyway, influencing commerce between states. And so I think you're absolutely right. There's so much more work we can do on reform, and I'm happy to talk about democracy reform if you'd like. But I think we have to go at climate change and many different approaches, and we have to be an active participant on the international stage by trying to form more partnerships abroad where we share our technologies and we make investments into these regions for strategic alliances as well as for economic development for our own companies here currently.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I definitely think like a high-speed rail would be really beneficial towards like getting people off of single-use cars, stuff like that. Like that's one of the main problems is like every single person thinks they need to have a car, while like ride sharing and just ways to transport people more quickly and more together instead of everybody turns on their car every day and everybody starts emitting the gas. Like it's not a realistic future and it's not sustainable.
I mean,
So
we're going to need cars in some places.
Sure.
Like
Some people will
obviously
need cars.
rural environments, obviously there's going to be certain transportation from industrial purposes, but like in our urban centers and connecting key urban centers across America, our infrastructure is so underdeveloped.
Yeah.
yeah, it really is. I mean, I know with Biden and the Build Back Better plan, there's a lot of stuff that he addresses in that bill. Which the thing about infrastructure bills, they take forever for you to really see them. It's
Yeah.
10, 20 years for you to really see it. But hey,
Because they're
like
usually like 200 pages long and not everyone's going to go through it, and then it's like, okay, well, some of the money's for the states and how do the states actually want to use it. Like there's a
Yeah.
lot of downstream effects that take a while, and it's a little bit
Construction takes
convoluted.
a while on its own, even
Yeah.
after they get fully passed. Like there's a lot of stuff.
yeah, so it's definitely hopefully we get some good changes. I had some interesting stats where I was talking to you guys. I pulled up something online because you guys said something interesting. You said to me that India and China, they're same polluters and they spend around the same amount of money. You guys are correct. So Asia spends just the Asia Peninsula. And this is kind of impolitically correct, but 58.8 billion. Asia, the continent, has spent on climate change initiatives. The United States has spent 9.46 billion. So
Both of
I'd
those
be
are
super curious how those numbers come to be because that seems very low to me.
Yeah, I was gonna
yeah.
say like both of those are just so low compared to what they could be. Like
Well, this is just the United States.
yeah.
Canada spends about 1.3 billion. Um, it's a very surprising fact is Europe.
Over what period, and do they give any criteria? Because to me
No,
that just doesn't sound believable,
no, this
frankly.
is a quick Google search. So
But
hold on
fair,
to your
but
feet here, guys.
yeah, no, I just know that like if we just talk about purely the bills we were talking about beforehand of like
Yeah,
the IRA or Build Back Better, what it used to be. Like the
yeah,
IRA was itself like $100 billion piece of legislation
it was.
just
Yeah.
just in the 1 year. Like it was more over multiple years. but
How much of that was towards green energy?
we were talking about $9 billion.
That's
before.
a good point. How much of that was actually towards green initiatives?
And I guess also, when is that like sourced from? Is it before, or like, all these investments? Who knows?
Let me see if I can give you guys a date, because you're right, that is important. I don't see a date in this article. It's I don't have a date on this article.
This is why people,
But
we always look for multiple sources.
It was written by Reuters, so
Okay.
that's some credibility to it. It just don't have.
I do like Reuters. I'll give
Yeah,
them that.
Yeah,
they're pretty good. But yeah, so they broke it down. They said that from Reuters. Let me say that perspective. Obviously, they got to check their sources. But Germany spent 45 billion. France spent 21 billion. European Commission spent 20.5. But the reason why I brought this up was because China was part of the Asian bloc that spent $58 billion, right? But technically, China only contributed 1.88 billion out of that 58.8 billion. The two biggest contributors in the Asian bloc was India with 20.4 billion. And I believe Japan was also a big one.
I don't know. I can't really talk on this article without reading it myself or
No,
seeing
no,
it
no.
on the screen.
Let me. I'm going to do you guys one solid, so I can stop referring to it. You guys.
Anyways, though.
So if you guys look at it, it's in the private chat, so you guys can read it yourselves. But so I seen this article quickly just now because I was trying to look up exactly what you guys are saying about the amount of money spent. It seems like even if the numbers are wrong, it still shows China significantly spending far little on climate change issues than the rest of the world.
They are spending a lot on like public transport though and infrastructure. So those are at least like.
So those are initiatives. So I don't know if that's going to be included into the green initiative because technically that's not really.
It helps get them off of climate change though.
It does, but it isn't.
We just you'd expect them to spend a lot more for how much they spend, how big of a population they have, and I don't know, the proclaimed communist socialist initiative that they have. Like they're not supposed to be as reliant on capitalism and which is like that's the big problem with our country is private interests influencing our climate change policies. And I mean, we already mentioned like there's individual choices too, but this all stems from media and how we are framing it as a country, how we are framing. And I think what you were saying is like interesting. You're talking about how cost effective it is.
Yeah.
And we're just the left in our country is just so bad at marketing. Like I get it. It's an environmental catastrophe and we're all going to die and this and that. And that's probably true. But like, that's not how you get conservatives to believe you, because the left says that about a lot of issues, which are generally true in some way. But if you say everything is the end of the world, they kind of like brush it off. If you say, hey, this is more cost effective for you, we're not going to you like our country. We don't want it to fall apart, but it's also going to save you money. It's going to save us money.
Yeah.
It's how you market it to the voters that does everything. Honestly, it makes it a lot more attractive for them to want to invest in something that's going to save them money over time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I do completely agree with you, Seth, that there is a problem with how we talk about these issues and that we do need to go from a more holistic rather than just an apocalypse framing. And, Jesse, to the point, since you did share that article, I wanted to give it a quick glance just so we could talk about it a little bit more. And what you were quoting beforehand was how much countries are committing to invest into other countries, not themselves, but how much they're willing to invest into developing nations to help them combat it. And then the specific billions you were quoting before was actually how much people were recipients of those funds from other nations. So there's a lot of money that these countries are willing to spend on their own improvement on these problems, but they're not necessarily spending as much towards these other nations. And I agree we should be spending more there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're saying this article is talking about how much has been given out.
Yeah,
So
not spent on themselves, but how much
Okay.
they're willing to give out and how much they're receiving in.
Okay. So
Yeah, and it's a lot more difficult in these developing countries because it's not like they have the GDP or the public spending available to invest all this money into infrastructure and into public transport and stuff like that. And as the countries continue to develop, they're going to move through a phase where they're all going to get individualized cars. They're going to catch up to where we were in like the 70s.
yeah.
It's going to be a while before these developing countries are going to be set at the same standard that we are holding European countries and stuff like
Unless
that.
we take
And that's
the
the real
opportunity to act now, because they don't have all that infrastructure built in. It's a lot easier to put down, solar right away if you don't got to strip up the past diesel generator systems. It's a lot easier to put down the tracks of train if you don't got the roads blocking it. It's a lot easier to put in so much sustainable infrastructure if you don't got to rip up all the old infrastructure first.
Yeah, so that brings me to the next point. So I see that, like we just discussed about the pledges being given or what's already been given to the developed countries. Have you guys known any examples of any developed countries really actually using this money for changes in their environment?
I don't know too much about what developing countries are doing. I'm not gonna lie. I'm more of a domestic policy guy.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that there are going to be a variety of cases, and back to Seth's point from way before about we have problems in our media. The U.S. media, I think, compared to many other media sources, is much more centric on their country. You talk about a global audience follows the politics of the USA.
Yeah.
How much do most Americans know, even what's going on in their neighboring countries?
I barely know what's going on in Canada.
And so
You're right next door,
a
Seth.
myopic view from U.S. media to not share all these stories. It's understandable you're going to have more of yourselves, but there's a mix. And I think ours is very heavy in American exceptionalism and just focusing on ourselves.
I know but I feel like this climate thing cannot be solved with just America. And I could be wrong, but the reality is we only can do so much.
But we can only control what we do.
Yes.
We can try to influence others.
We can influence.
We can only
that's
control what we do.
Yeah.
And so that's part of accepting that we're not an imperialist nation. We're not going to go boots on the ground and force our way on people. We want to offer people the better future because we think there's a more sustainable path. And we want to welcome them on that journey, and we want to be good partners.
The best way we can influence
them. Rally the global community to start saying, hey, you know what? We're not going to be as free exchanging with you all because you're not upholding certain global community standards. And so it's not an imperialism of one. It's the imperialism of the many to influence how we all as humanity want the future to go. It's not just one government. It is us all culturally influencing and not doing exchange with certain actors if we don't like what they're doing.
But isn't that the point of the United Nations, is to be that one government voice for the world?
Sure.
Yeah, but didn't they just have like Iran move to like the human rights? Like you can't really use the UN right
I'm
now.
just telling you what the point of having this global organization is so that we can control essentially, well, the real intent was so that another war wouldn't break out. But truly, the intent is to make sure that we are on the same page as a world, that we don't want conflict. We want to do what's best for humanity in totality and not just think about individual countries. I feel like climate change is the main, that's like kind of the main thing. Like, okay, what's affecting the world? It's climate. You're affected from Hawaii all the way to the North African panhandle. Those are all global issues that can be solved by a country, like you guys said. But as saying that, there are countries who have major influence in the United Nations and can really dictate the policies of the world. But
not even just the United Nations, but just in general, the United States has the most influence out of any country on earth. Like even China, Even China has their amount of influence. We have more influence. And I was talking about, we need to start leading with us. We need to start investing in our country because we are the leaders for the rest of the world. They're not going to do anything if the United States can't even get their shit together. Like, how can we influence these countries to do stuff that we're not even doing?
Mhm.
Like, we need to take back our democracy. We need to start, delivering things that we want the rest of the world to deliver on. Like, we can't talk about how China has a big problem with democracy. Russia has a big problem with democracy. When we are ranked like upper middle in the democracy index, like, we have a lot of problems at home that we need to get before we can even begin to influence other countries.
Yeah.
And it comes back to stuff like campaign finance and the lack of trust that we have in our government because we don't offer anything to our people.
Seth, I gotta say, you're touching on a point I love so much in the relationship between democracy and international relations, because it's huge. Because I think one problem that we're really getting at with the fraying democracy is a lack of predictability and stability in our leadership. When you have a country that is constantly every 4 to 8 years doing a complete 180 and is potentially not even certain of who is going to lead it at certain cases because of challenged results, there's not a lot of faith that you can have your debts honored, that they're going to be there to come to your defense when they can do a 180 overnight. You need to say that there's certain binding threads that is going to say, hey, we can have this nation be a bit predictable, because a predictable partner is a good partner.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
No,
as long as it's predictably good.
Yes. Yeah. True.
Yes. Russia is as predictable as it comes, but that's not a good thing. We can see what Russia's doing at any given moment. They're just trying to undermine democracy and expand, and basically they're just traditionalists, and they're just trying to rebuild a new empire. It's like, we got to set the standard for the world of what democracy looks like, because India is the largest democracy in the world, but they are also kind of still a developing country. So we are the next ones up. China's not a democracy. Russia's not a democracy. We need to start setting the standard for the world in everything we do. The way we treat people, the amount of freedom we grant people, the amount of opportunities we grant people. And we have the resources. We just need to get the voting base in line to get just enough above the 60 people in the Senate. Like, there's just a few little areas in which it would make dramatic changes for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Like, just minor areas, minor little fixes in democracy, and we could deliver so much for the entire world.
I want to just touch on that very briefly before, Jesse, you chime in there.
Yeah.
I just want to make the point that people should not just look to that federal level and getting those 60 votes.
Yeah.
There's so much locally that you're supposed to do for democracy reform, because guess where voting methods are controlled? It's not at the federal level. We have this rule that the states get to set their voting systems. And so where do you need to make the change? You got to go do it in your state and local politics.
Mm-hmm.
That's very true. And I mean, I would say this, just my 2 cents on it. Me and Jenny was talking about this earlier, that it's about time that we really have a serious conversation about term limits for our elected officials, because that goes to some stability. If you got a guy for 8 years and he has the people, okay, it's gonna sound weird, but I'll say it anyway. It's gonna be really weird. You know how the British do their politics when they elect their prime minister, and everyone usually is majority.
The parliamentary system.
Yeah, it's crazy. If you ever watched that, I've watched it a couple of times. Where they're like, have you ever watched that? Where you have the British actually are
in their parliament,
in
like
their
where
parliament,
they're all just yelling at each other.
and they're just like heckling each other.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Process. It's very funny.
I like parliamentary systems personally, but
yeah, it's very funny. But I was thinking that term limits would kind of help introduce that system into America, where we have a fixed term for senators, fixed terms for House of Representatives, and obviously we have fixed terms for president. But ushering that in will essentially get more things done, because it'll be more, instead of it's because right now we have a system where, if you guys follow the history of politics, every 8 years we tend to switch presidents. Um, that's just how it is from one party to the next. We never ever. I think the last time that ever happened was FDR, where you had a president actually from one party set for 3 terms. For the most part, it's always
Yeah.
No,
2 terms.
you had the Republicans through the 80s and 90s. You had Reagan. You had Reagan into Bush. Just
Reagan.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
the
yes,
same administration. Good
yes.
point.
That was the only second time I think. I don't think there's any more outside of that one.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that was it too. Yeah, so that was a good one. So we have that because generally Americans like change every 8 years. They don't really want to keep the same party in power. But with House of Representatives and Senate, they don't have that system. So the guy who's been there for 6 years, who has great name ID, will be there for 30 years, because as you know, as you know about politics, the longer you stay around, the more exposure you have to newer people because you've been around for so long. So what
I
happens?
feel like it has a lot to do with finance, though, right? Because they
Finance
have
in
the
part, but it's also name ID. It's people.
name ID helps, and it's important, and a lot of people will trust. But like, they're not going to vote for somebody that they know of that they dislike. But
Of course, yeah.
but if you have all the advantage when it comes to ads and funding, there's a lot you can do to maintain your incumbent
No, not
advantage.
really. I mean, for example, Jeb Bush, he had all the money in the world. He lost completely, terrible, and he lost. Name ID for is strong when people don't like you. Obviously, like if you kind of play the fence a little bit and don't have a higher unfavorability rate, you tend to get elected. So what you're saying is like someone like Chris Christie. I'm sorry, someone like who's that guy that
Mitch McConnell,
Mike
you
Pence.
might be right because
Yeah,
Mitch McConnell has an incredibly low approval rating, and he's not even approved by Republicans in his own in the area he's representing. Like they don't even like him there, but they keep voting for him. So
it's
you might have a little bit of a point on
it's
that.
name ID. Like Mike Pence, like everyone doesn't want him to be president. Everyone know he's not going to be president of the United States,
Yeah,
but people know his name, so he's getting on the debate stage because they're like, oh yeah, I know Mike Pence, but it's not like we really expect.
but isn't that also experience?
No, it's all about name ID.
No, I know, but people know the name because they know he has experience too. Like that contributes the establishment advantage. It's just as much as just being an incumbent. Like just being trusted by, I don't know, they kind of go hand in hand, I guess, but it has a lot to do with being tied to the establishment and having the party back you too. The party backing an incumbent or backing an establishment politician, I think, does more than just the name recognition on its own.
But they're never going to not back you, though. That's the thing. If you've been in politics for 6 years, I actually think it's a sexual rule. Once you get elected, well, I don't know about on the federal level. I know on the state level. Once you get elected, I believe the second term in Florida, they actually have to back you. It's like it's called
Well, that's a problem.
it's like a Democratic caucus fund, something like that. A House Democratic.
I don't think they should just back incumbents.
That's a party role. Yeah.
It's a party rule. It's like
yeah, and that's a whole other can of worms to go in if you wanted to into the Democratic Party and certain things like that. But
yeah,
I'd love to just speak on the idea of term limits for
sure, yeah. Go ahead.
Because I'm going to take the unpopular position if I'm genuinely torn on the issue. Like I actually have sentiments on both ways. To the point of agreeing with you both, there is power in incumbency advantage. It comes from, as Seth mentioned, in money. It comes from name ID, and that people just, when they see an ad, it recognizes, it sticks in their brain. It's like, I've heard that name before. You have to hear certain things until it kind of actually becomes a long-term memory and impacts on you. That's why people inundate you on the waves of ads where it's not like they care about hearing even the message sometimes. They just want you to hear the name over and over. So when you see it again on the ballot box, you're like, oh, that's familiar. But there's also the edge of like relationship advantages. There is such a thing about being able to have people on the Hill who come and stump for you and bring in their network of donors to you and have all of those advantages of saying, I actually did things. You can point to specific things rather than a lot of voters, when it comes to that newcomer, it's like, is this person real? Like, there's that kind of effect. So even a known entity, like, you have that feeling of real, you know who they are. Even if it's like a Hollywood image of them or what have you painted through the media, you have some image of who they could be rather than an unknown in some degrees. But on the side of not being completely for term limits, that comes in the idea of, there is some advantages of having expertise when it comes to being a legislator. Like,
I agree.
Technical expertise. Now, obviously, a lot of the responsibilities now, and I don't know how many people actually know this, is not done by the actual person you elect. It's done by their interns and staffers on the Senate and House floors. They are the people who actually write the legislation. They give them a lot of talking points and what they want to talk to, but the minutia is done by that. But the specific legislative technicalities comes from experience, and a lot of voters simply because a lot of parties value expertise, because that's how you gain leadership from time being in the party and serving, and more people trusting you and pledging to you in certain ways. They feel like they get more influence as a voter by putting in someone with more experience, because that person is more likely to actually put the thumb on the bill of what the outcome is. Because I don't know if you know this, but you really don't have 435 people crafting a bill together. It's usually a handful of the actual leaders from the various caucuses that come together and negotiate these things. Mm-hmm. And so people love experience because they think that's going to get them their in to have a little bit more say when they genuinely feel like they don't have influence. So that's why you get the Mitch McConnells who are disapproved by their parties and disapproved by, Kentucky as a whole, who are super old, constantly getting elected again. It's because people think they can still get certain things done from that experience, and they got that name ID. So, conclusion, I genuinely don't know what I would want on term limits. I'd probably support them if they were longer term limits so that you could still build up some of that expertise. Like if you had an 18-year term limit, I'd probably agree. But if you start making it 8 years, I'm going to be like, nah, then the donors are just going to buy a recurring cycle of new candidates coming through. You can't build that loyalty with your voter base from being an independent. So I'm torn.
I think things like the House of Representatives need to have longer term limits. I think would actually do more benefit, because the thing that you weren't mentioning about
term
people
length or term limit.
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Yeah, term length, because the second they're elected, they have immediately start running for re-election, and they're not focusing on writing legislation. While in the Senate, you have a little bit more room and you have a little bit more time and experience that's gained because you don't have to spend all your time running for re-election.
Yeah.
And I don't think representatives are that beneficial to us for that very reason. And it's so easy to flip or for them to stay for a long time. I don't know. You build that sort of advantage, and it makes it. I don't know. I think having that's kind of the idea of the Supreme Court. If they're not constantly running for re-election, then they have a lot more. They don't have to worry about losing their appointment. They can just focus on, writing or making judgments from the heart instead of what the voters would prefer. You know what I mean? They're trying to make actual unbiased decisions.
And I agree with you. That was how the Supreme Court was viewed for a very long time, for hundreds and 200 years. But I gotta admit, even as a lawyer, I'm kind of disappointed in Justice Thomas. Because it's you have kind of ruined that sensibility that people look and see okay, I may disagree with them, and he may be right leaning, but in his viewpoints, but you never question if he's being bought politically. It's that's not where that position's supposed to be. That position is supposed to be impartial. Yes, you may have your viewpoints that are lean right or lean left, but for the most part, it's an impartial seat. And he kind of tainted that in many people's eyes as that's not really impartial.
Yeah.
And so I don't know.
We have at least one corporate seat in the Supreme Court.
One corporate
just whatever the corporations want. corporations are represented at least 1/9, if not more than that.
Nah,
Which is a little.
I don't think Supreme
I
Court needs
genuinely
them.
feel like in this case that we need to kind of go at it, not like directly at Justice Thomas, because unfortunately,
Yeah.
the partisan impact is going to make impeaching that man literally impossible.
Oh, yeah.
And
True.
so, how do you hold them accountable? You got to do
Passing
general
legislation,
SCOTUS
maybe.
reform. You got to say, like, term limits on judges. Or, they have in, I think, the Constitution that you got to have them be appointed for life to the federal court. Well, rotate them down to the lower federal court instead of the Supreme Court and bring a new judge up.
Yeah.
You got to have some
Something like
reform,
that.
because if you just go at the one conservative judge to hold them accountable, even if they are justifiably corrupt, the partisan lens starts to happen.
Yeah.
And so you got to, I think, tackle it from a more universal, long-term reform approach.
And it's kind of sick that we're just waiting for them to die.
Yeah, it's gotta.
Yeah.
It is. It's like, man, how old is this guy? Jesus, what is he drinking prune juice in the morning? It's like,
Yeah.
why is he staying up like that? But no, I mean, I don't think that Supreme Court should have term limits, just because there are like the grandfathers of our government. So they're like, they don't allow us to do like crazy stuff. Like, for the most part, like I can
Should they
sit there
be
and sit here.
kings? Are they divinely
Yeah, I don't-
appointed? It's got to be for life.
I mean, it's just like there's old people in the room. It's like, I saw this in
They're going to be old
1930.
regardless.
I
Probably.
saw this in 1930. It's the same thing. We're gonna pass this bill. It's like I said, the only issue the Supreme Court's had recently for me, and they've passed some crazy stuff lately, but the one major issue is the whole getting spent on lavishly by donors, like, or people that's affiliated with one party. That's
So,
the only
Jesse, like,
technical thing.
how do you keep them accountable in your mind? Like, honestly.
You keep it. Well, here's the thing: to get something to the Supreme Court, first of all, they want to hear that, right? So anything that you hear in the Supreme Court is something that the Supreme Court wants to hear, because every single case they can kick it out. They can pretty much say, I don't want to hear it. And so
Yeah.
what they're doing when they do that is they're trying to make policy. People say that they're not, but they are.
It's true.
It's generally when they hear a case, they're trying to create a framework. Like a lot of things with abortion, like I disagree with what they did. I think that they there was a system in place that was perfectly fine. They shouldn't have touched it. But I understand they're conservatives. They're like, well, we don't want the federal government to control what we do, so we're bringing it back to the states. That's a conservative leaning judge. I can tell you, I practice all the time. There's conservative judges that are like that, and there's judges who are left who would interpret the Constitution, their own interpretations of it. So I disagree with the decision, but I understood it came from a position of just how they constitutionally view things, almost like Anthony Scalia a little bit. He was like that. Like I disagree with him on a lot of positions, but it was always based
He's
on.
somewhat respectable.
He was respectable because he's always based it on his principles of conservatism. So that's why it's going to swing the other way. It always does. I mean, a lot of the reforms that we got during FDR and a lot of reforms we got under LBJ were because we had a left-leaning Supreme Court. It was like,
well, also it's because he threatened to pack the court.
Yeah, that too.
Right? That, like, even having a liberal court doesn't guarantee things are going to pass. Sometimes you need to put a little feet to the fire.
Yeah,
you kind of got to.
No, I agree with you, and you can do the same here. I mean, the reality is we make a big deal about the Supreme Court. If we really have political courage, any one of their decisions can be overturned. Any single one of their decisions. None of their decisions can trump the United States Congress. Congress can come out tomorrow and it's like, we're gonna pass a statute that makes abortion legal in every 50 states. Make it legal in 50 states and get rid of that Supreme Court opinion overnight. So this power that people think the Supreme Court has, it's not really power. It's just more so they want to make policies, and our Congress is kind of weak. They don't want to test those policies, so they let the Supreme Court do it. And they just well, the Supreme Court did it, and we have nothing to do with it. They're just politically weak, and they don't want to take it up That's what it is. So I blame both sides. Like even Democrats on the abortion issue. I'm like, you guys, if you have political courage, you will force a bill down the Republicans' throat because technically you have that political power to do it. But
Yeah,
they don't want.
if you do have the majority, I'm curious. Like, are you saying that the form of accountability we should have for SCOTUS is simply making it easier to pass legislation in the House that could then override it? Is that your thought? I just want to make
I
sure
think
to
that's
that
how.
question, like, how do you keep
But
them accountable?
But that's how it was. That's how it was created. It was created that way. It was created that the Supreme Court has power, but the Congress can always override their power because the Supreme Court's power is based on if something's constitutional or not, and they make the decision that well, this is considered constitutional, this is considered not constitutional. Well, guess what? The United States Congress can change the Constitution. The United States Congress can pass laws that trump the Supreme Court. So the United States Congress always have more
That's
power
true.
than the Supreme Court. What happens is the United States Congress likes to play political football with things, and they're like, we don't really want to touch that issue, so we're going to blame the Supreme Court for it, but we just don't really want to touch it or pass any
Yeah.
bills related to it.
Even if they touch that, though, a 2/3 like majority to get something passed is pretty high. That's what an amendment takes currently. So, like, to override it to just say it's constitutional, you gotta have 2/3 majority. And so, either you're making constitutional amendments much easier, which has its own ramifications.
Yeah,
if
it's
you think
hard.
about it.
Yeah, that's right.
But it,
Or
but
you're
here's an
not
example.
keeping these judges accountable. Like,
Here's
that's why
another
I'm
example.
suggesting I think we need reforms directly on the judge to not have it be a lifetime sentence. That way, if someone's corrupt,
I
well,
agree
at
with
least
that.
they're done in 18 years instead of it's their whole life.
I'll give another example. We, for a long time in this country, fought against gay rights. And when the Supreme Court said, yes, you can get married, shortly thereafter, 5 or 6 years later, United States Constitution, or United States Congress passed a statute legalizing it throughout the whole entire country. Because guess what? That Supreme Court opinion doesn't really have effect on, the states. A lot of people don't understand. So the courts can't do anything per se unless the statute is in place. So yes, for example, they can say that it's illegal to have an abortion in this country, right? They can't enforce it. It's all enforced through the executive branch. So a lot of people think that the
Legislative branch?
executive branch.
Oh, okay. I
The
thought you said the
legislative branch,
Congress did too.
the only people that can enforce laws in this country are the executive
Well, I
branch.
guess they have to sign it through the executive branch. You're right.
No, to actually make it like a punishable offense is the executive branch. The legislative branch has no bearing on it, and the judicial branch has no bearing on it. A lot of people don't know that. The only people who can enforce things are the executive branch. So all these laws that get passed, like this is happening right now in Florida with DeSantis. And sorry, I'm going a little tangent here, soapbox. But a lot of the laws that are passed in Florida, a lot of the state attorneys, it's like, yeah, we're not going to prosecute that. And DeSantis gets upset because he's like, well, I'm telling you to. And it's like, well, we're state attorneys. You don't really tell us what laws we're going to prosecute or not. And so he fires them to put someone in his place so they can actually enforce the laws because that he wants. So that's just because that's how the way government works. So the courts are there just to interpret law and give their opinion. The Congress are there just to essentially write law, which is usually written very terrible. If you guys ever read your laws, they're written very, very bad. And they're there to write them. And then the executive branch, chooses which ones they want to enforce, which ones they don't want to enforce. And that's our government. So a lot of stuff that you guys see, it's just political footballing. It's like, that's all it is. It's just like, yeah, we don't want to touch that, so we're going to blame it on them. And they're like, well, we don't want to touch that, so we're going to blame it on them. But the reality is, that's how it works. And so when I say the accountability of our Supreme Court, I say that ethically, Justice Thomas is wrong.
Yeah.
But his conservative viewpoints are, that's what it is. We can always surpass him if we really had the political courage to say, hey, we're going to pass legislation to make abortion legal throughout the 50 states. Because if that was the case, I mean, there was many things like civil rights in America wouldn't have gone through if we just let's go listen to the Supreme Court. It's like no, there's things that we can do, or the Congress can do to surpass it. It's like just like people don't realize it's like the laws are very loosey goosey, and so once you realize laws are loosey goosey, you're not as upset because you're like, yeah, for every rule there's an exception to it, and that's just the way the law is written in America. So I'm doing my soapbox, guys, but that was my 2 cents on accountability for the Supreme Court.
What I hear from that is the executive branch is very important.
Yes.
And, whether or not you like Joe Biden or think he's too old, his administration carries a lot more weight than just the man who signs the bills passed by Congress. Like,
yeah, think about
it's very important that we elect Joe Biden or somebody hopefully better, but please don't waste your vote on Cornel West if you live in Georgia or something. You know what I mean? Please don't waste your vote.
Good guy.
Re-elect Republicans.
Here's another example, guys, since I'm on the soapbox here, of how the Supreme Court is out of power. Remember, recently the Supreme Court just came out with this this case. It's like, well, Biden can't forgive student loans, right? Such a big deal. That's like, oh no, the Supreme Court they were able to, yeah, and so they're Biden's coming out. They can't. The Supreme Court said he can't forgive him. Oh no, everyone's like lost. Next thing you know, Biden comes out 2 weeks later. It's like, hey, we're going to do a savers plan. And you're not going to have to pay back if you make this amount of money. So mostly everyone's paying like zero now. And like back in student loans. And why? Because he's the federal government. He's the executive branch.
Yeah.
He's the one who enforces the laws. So if he's saying that, hey, this is the law I want to enforce, guess what? You don't have to pay back student loans. I didn't cancel it, but you don't have to pay it back.
Yeah, he pushed a lot harder on the student loan thing than I ever expected him to. So I applaud him on that.
Yeah.
I applaud the unions, like the IRA. There's tons of things that got passed that are way surpasses my expectations of what I thought Biden presidency would look like.
I have a good idea for next week's show. And this is
for what?
The next week's show. I have a good idea. If John can come back, I definitely would like him to come back. I want to talk about spend an hour about
potentially. We could come back again.
Yeah. Next week we have Alan Ellison on.
Yes. Oh, next week?
Yes.
Okay. Then the following week we're gonna get John back and we're gonna talk about this show.
If his schedule works.
If his schedule works. I want to have an hour talking about the legislation that Joe Biden's gotten passed, what he's done. Because he's done so much for a president that most people do not talk about it or don't even know the complexities of what he's doing because he's just
true.
I mean, he's not really able to articulate it right now, but he's done some crazy stuff.
The pros and cons of the Biden presidency for sure. Like we can't just do the good accomplishments. He did do bad stuff too. So we should just cover what actually happened so far in the last few years.
Since he's been elected. That's a great idea. John, so I promise you an hour. So I'm going to give you the last word here. Shoot out your Twitter handle, say your final remarks, and we got to get more people to follow you because you have a lot of great insight. So,
well, I appreciate the kind words there. But yeah, Jesse, Seth, thank you for having me on. If people want to hear more from me, just go to Twitter or I guess X now. It's going to be Twitter. I don't care. I'm going to keep calling it that. But go to Jon Munitz and you'll hear me there. Big thing I talk about a lot is universal policies and why it's better than a lot of these targeted programs. And I'm happy to come back another time to talk through that. I want to make the one mention on like the point of like the presidency. I'm most likely going to become a supporter for Biden. I'm waiting my time. There's still a lot that can happen in this time period.
Yeah.
But
the Democratic,
I want to just say to people who are voting third party, I disagree, but I respect your desire because I think it's very important for us to evolve to a multi-party democracy. I think it makes a lot of sense for us to have more representation and for people to not feel trapped into just two parties. I completely agree with you. And I even understand your side to the strategic concern of putting that outside pressure. I disagree with you. I think that we do need to be more in risk mitigation in this election cycle. People say it's never going to end. We're always going to have to just do the vote blue no matter who. We can't put this external pressure. I do genuinely think that this is a transition cycle. And I know you'll come hold me accountable if I start saying something different in 2028. And it can change. He could run again. Some new thing is a faction that's trying to have a civil war element. Things change. We have to be certain on that. But like, I think we need to focus so much more, and this is my final message, on the state and local level. So much attention goes to federal politics, which is in many ways gridlocked. There is so much more influence you can do on your local and state level, and they are the ones that control how democracy works. So please try to get involved in any way in the state and local politics at your wherever you are.
I like that. That's a great way to end. Seth?
I 100% agree. That's a great point. You know, do what we can for 2024, but you know, we do need to expand our democracy further. So, you know, the executive branch is really important. So if you live in a swing state, like, but you know, whatever you choose to do with your vote, I understand Biden's not perfect, but
yeah,
you know, Supreme Court and all that stuff.
Yeah, this is a great show. I mean, I think everyone kind of got everyone's perspective on what we need to do as a country and as a as a citizen, where our duties are, because we never really understand that. I mean, our duties is to elect people who are representing us and what our interests are, and it's not designed for represent people corporate interests. It's designed to represent individual interests. And so we have to take the mantle as citizens of this country and elect people who represent our needs. And I think Jon said it right on the nail. Focus local, focus state, and focus federal last, because those are the hierarchy of our government. And the executive branch has more control than you think. I think we've learned this from Trump. We've learned this from DeSantis. We've learned this over and over again, that we have to start focusing on our local and state politics. So with that being said, guys, I hope you guys imagine more, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
See ya.